first of all, thank you very much to the Museum of Byzantine Culture, first for the exhibition and also for inviting me. I feel very honoured to be here as a non-German and a non-Greek, and but with a long history in amateur photography. Also to the German Consulate for its contribution to the exhibition and the conference. I've actually changed the title of my paper since I sent the abstract some months ago, as you see, to the revelation and resistance of amateur images at war. And my paper is going to be about how do we interpret these images, very much coming without a knowledge. What do we do with them when we don't have the knowledge that Professor Sachse has when he comes to them? How do we read them? How do we understand them? Yeah. Okay, so photography and the modern battlefield belong together. They have developed side by side thanks to the technologies they depend on. Cameras, repeating rifles, lenses, viewfinders, chemical processing, machine engineering, and battalions, and the list continues. These are the inventions, the twin inventions of 19th century modernity. The propaganda use of photographs in wartime is evident. Used to make an ideological argument, to convince a nation, to create national identity, to enlist, to motivate potential soldiers, for use in reconnaissance missions, and the list goes on. All of these intentions underline the marriage of photography and war within modernity. The goals of amateur photography within the war effort are less clear. If the intention of amateur photography is known, it may be unrecognisable in the resultant images. Alternatively, there can be multiple intentions, none of which is certain. The amateur is where the official equation between war and photography can break down. That is, the amateur photograph exposes or can expose the vulnerability of the official uses of photography in wartime. The amateur image can create havoc rather than conviction. The amateur image is where resistance and dissension have a potential to unfold. It is where the organisation and force of modernity fall apart or can fall apart, showing the mirror of modernity's undoing. Often this is not consciously done, and it is the task of us as critics and viewers, especially so many years later, to trace these pressure points at which everything comes undone. The goal of my paper today is therefore to think about how amateur images taken by soldiers at war are shifting, multifaceted, and images in which meanings mutate over time within history, according to viewers. They can also take on contradictory meanings endlessly. And how do we understand this then within the organisation of war, given photography's instrumentality in that organisation? The amateur image has a potential to show this breakdown, as I say, in the relation between war and photography, a relationship that is usually taken as evidence of its efficiency, its contribution to organisation and advance of modernity. I'm going to focus on two pressure points today, sites of slippage, where the amateur image reveals more than its intention, or more or less than it is supposed to. These moments are, I shall argue, points where the amateur image can be interpreted and understood from in multiple ways, ultimately to resist and challenge the ideological edicts of the perpetrator, even as the perpetrator's edicts often slip through the reality of the image. And the first of these, as Professor Saxa has pointed to already, is the context of interpretation as a mnemonic archive. And the second is the image itself as an archive of memories. So the first is its context, the second is the image itself. The amateur image is multiple, contradictory, evasive, and enjoys a proliferation of a completely different order from any official published copyright photograph. In turn, the fluidity of the amateur image allows it to come closer to finding the truths of events on and off the battlefield. These truths may not be immediately visible, but they're often locatable within single images and across multiple amateur photographs, particularly when they belong to a collection or reorganised for exhibition, publication in albums, as gifts to families and loved ones, or used to rewrite the identity of a soldier through collection in an album. Like officially produced, disseminated and consumed photographs of war and violence, the amateur represents a perspective, only a perspective on what it sees. Its perspective is always open to interpretation, and it's often built on inconsistency, contradiction, and mistakes. Underexposure, for example, badly printed or copied, often in such long distance that it's difficult to see what we're meant to be focusing on. And we can study imperfections, flaws in a series of albums in their repetitions and the chart's inclusions in the frame, in their juxtaposition with other images. The truth seeps through the cracks found often where they are not meant to be seen. In the collection of Byron-Mitos images of the occupation in Thessaloniki, we find photographs that represent the icons of occupation. Familiar, the flags, the armies, soldiers in uniform. Sometimes in the very next image we see the everyday, the banality of the soldier's life at war. And in this image we see the two together. We see the man who is a soldier and a young man with his dog. Here we see different soldiers from different armies posing together as tourists. Well, these different sides of war can never really be resolved. They're always in conflict, or there is always an underlying tension. But the amateur album is able to embrace both because its meaning and coherence comes from somewhere else, not from within in the image. It can come from the identity of the one who creates the album, or in this case, as we see in the exhibition today, from a city, Thessaloniki, in search of a deeper knowledge of its own past. There are images which are carefully staged, meticulously framed, and there are others taken on a whim. The nice reflection in the water being a focus, the identification of importance in this image is otherwise not fully clear. Each instantiation of the photograph, whether it be collection on pages in an album by an anonymous soldier, expansion by addition of more photographs, reorganization, perhaps by the daughter of the photographer who sold them to Byron-Mitos. They're purchased by a collector, Byron-Mitos, his reorganization of them, their consequent publication in this book, or now in the exhibition here at the Museum of Byzantine Culture. Their meaning every time is reformulated and their identity shifts. The collection or collections of photographs come together to form a living, constantly evolving archive. Through its representation, its perpetual representation, the collection of photographs takes on more and still more levels of meaning. And each of these meanings will shift and change with each organisation, the place of the image within its new narrative. The images are given explanation by this exhibition, so we read them in a certain way, their truth apparently revealed. The story is laid out for us, often where the images don't tell a story of their own. To give one short example, the exhibition collects the images of architectural styles and different monuments. We see this in the exhibition. There's a vitrine devoted to the architectural styles. They're brought together as documents of Thessaloniki, as it was in this little documented historical moment. The images offer a window onto the past. But as we know already, the photographer has been taught to take photographs from a particular perspective of particular buildings, to deliver a history that is known in advance of his arrival in Thessaloniki. He's not giving us, the soldier who takes these photographs is not giving us an objective architectural history. We are given that history from viewing the images together within the exhibition. So how much and what exactly do these images tell about the real Thessaloniki during the years of occupation? The collection of photographs is what has been termed a mnemonic archive. The archive creates memories, memory aids for long-term retaining of images, for recovery of images. The question of whose memory then arises. Whose memory do we see in the photographs exhibited here at the museum? Whose memory gives the photographs its meaning within any narrative? The anonymous soldier, the soldiers in the image, the soldiers whose photographs were added by the anonymous soldier, the collector, Byron Metis, the daughter who sold them to him, the curators of the exhibition, the people of Thessaloniki who visit it. The possibilities are endless as these images are organised and reorganised throughout the years since they were taken. And each, as I say, each instantiation creates new meaning for the images. And each proliferates the perspective of war in the image. And of course, the interpretation is always opened out with each further instantiation. And of course, this is in distinction to an official image that has a known photographer, a first publication, an exhibition which comes to circumscribe it, to define it, to identify it. In the mnemonic archive, narrative depends on an order, a categorization. That's what archives do. That in itself alerts us to the fact that something has been left out in an attempt to create order and meaning, to give a narrative. So what is the logic behind the process of classification of these images? Did the daughter who sold them to Byron Metis also re-narrativize them, re-categorize them with a certain logic that we don't know about? And before her, the soldier, her father, who chose the and then of course after him, who chooses the images that go into the exhibition? According to what logic? We must always ask all of these questions as we look at the collection. It is a full archive, an archive that has nevertheless been re-archived for the exhibition. So if the collection is of 3,000 photographs and we see 300, what of the 2,700 still in their albums? What do they represent? On what basis are these images not placed in the exhibition? And of course, with our extra time in Thessaloniki, the first thing Professor Saxter and I did was went and had a look at the images that were left out of the exhibition. It's a natural curiosity, so what's not in there? Because this idea that we're not getting a full picture from a selection that has been made. And then, of course, what is the new narrative of the 2,700 once the 300 have been removed for exhibition? Why are the images we see not in chronological order in the exhibition? And of course, in their albums, they're not in chronological order. And so, of course, what is the order that they've been that they have been organised in? So there are many questions that are left unanswered and will always be unanswered by a collection of amateur photographs. The multiple attempts to organise and categorise are also, as we've seen, inscribed on the reverse. So we see 3, sometimes 4 different numbers. Yes, that one of them may belong to the census, but whose are the other numbers? What narrative were they in before? And what's more, some images, and we've seen this image before, tell us what to look at. What do we do when what we see is not what we're told we see? And of course, this will change when it depends on who's asking us to look. What is the status of the writing on the back? Do we look at the image or do we read? It is, of course, Thessaloniki from the point of view of the German soldier from the train station, which he's conveniently left out. So, of course, what it tells us is more about him, or does it tell us more about him than about Thessaloniki? Every time these images are represented, whether for private or public consumption, they are re-articulated. Ulrich Baer, in his book on Nazi photography, says of images that are represented and re-narrativized, particularly amateur ones, taken in the Warsaw Ghetto, that re-narrativization ascribes, and I quote, to sets of images meanings that are not reliably inscribed within the photographs themselves, end of quote. The amateur soldier has been charged, as we know, with a representation of how the Nazi propaganda ministry wanted him to see, how to be in Greece. At one with the people, Germany is great. The soldier is given a perspective in advance of anything he sees through the viewfinder. And so we ask, what is this perspective of Thessaloniki that we're given by the photographs? Yes, it is opposite the station, but from a German perspective, beyond what we see in the frame. What is beyond what we see in the frame? What time of day is the photograph taken? Why is the street empty? Is the photograph staged? Was traffic suspended? Why is the boy in the middle of the street? Because the image is in long shot, what exactly are we meant to focus on? What we're told on the back of the image that we're supposed to see. And then, of course, the question comes, how do we know that the soldier is obeying his orders? And the questions continue and they begin to mount, and the truth of the photograph can begin to unravel. Soldiers didn't just shoot as instructed. Sometimes something might catch the eye. For some reason, the soldier sees the main attraction, the landmark, but he also sees things that can't be predicted by the propaganda ministry. I've slightly lost my place. Okay. Okay, no one stops him putting the images of a poor man without a leg into his album as images which record his memory, his everyday experience in 1942 Thessaloniki. Images that record who he wanted to be, whoever he might be. Bear also says the camera can record sights that are not within the control of the photographer. End of quote, which leads to the second pressure point, the image itself as an archive. It's not only the organisation of the narrative through exhibition as image archive that secretes the uncensored, that which is not meant to be there, but the narratives that run through each image do the same. The moments caught unawares, the chance sightings, the person who happens to walk into the frame, the juxtapositions and context given within images reveal truths that might not be looked upon favourably by the authorities. The circumstances and events of everyday life that the official photograph doesn't show are, I would argue, exposed for us in the amateur image. It's true, we do not see atrocities, full-on atrocities of death and abuses of the occupiers, let alone the decimation of the Jewish population. But the traces of injustice are everywhere. Then they might have, in certain cases they hide, the truth can be hidden with the title. Today, so we see here it's the English who are doing the bombing, not the Germans. When we look at these images, there is less likelihood of hiding the violence of occupation. Even when they're well made, images reveal against themselves the starvation, poverty, the violations of cultural reality. Yes, there are images which often stage the harmony between Germans and locals, many with children. In this very potent image, we see the children happy, apparently, enjoying coexistence with the Germans. But there are just as many that juxtapose the trauma, the huge distinction between them and us, between Germans and locals, and the differences are endless. The religious differences are pronounced in images such as this, where we see the use of a church in order to sign the marriage documents in April 1941. We also note the differences in dress, in age, in the modes of transport used between Germans and locals, in the fact that the locals work, the Germans are usually relaxing. In one of the most egregious examples of the violence of occupation, the presence of Roman script on the buildings in the signs that denote occupation, inhabitation, and colonization. The Roman letters fill spaces where the Greek alphabet is meant to be, or where there should be nothing at all. The imposition of the swastika and the V that we see in the examples in the exhibition is a violation, V for violation. The words are a form of graffiti. They are intended to erase, to counter the culture that owns the surface. They appropriate it. Graffiti is this act of scarring. As Rosalind Krauss argues, it is performative, and I quote, performative, suspending representation in favour of action. I mark you, I cancel you, I dirty you. Second, it is violent, always an invasion of a space that is not the marker's own. It takes illegitimate advantage of the surface of inscription, violating it, mauling it, scarring it. Third, it converts the present tense of the performative into the past tense of the index. It is the trace and of event torn away from the presence of the marker. It says, in this case, this is German property. For us, the viewer, in 2016, graffiti is a violation, a cruel occupation. We might even call the many parades, the events and festivities, such as the celebration, as we see in this image of the Führer's birthday, we might call it a form of graffiti. These photographs demonstrate the writing over, the imposition on local culture of the traditions and celebrations and holidays as though the local doesn't matter or doesn't exist. With this graffiti, other cultures are in the past, they become erased. What remains interesting about this mythos collection, at least as it is exhibited here, is that there are no obvious atrocities, and the photographs show both sides, the occupied and the occupier, even if it is an attempt to convince of this peaceful coexistence. The two are side by side. Baer argues in his work on the Holocaust image, particularly the amateur of the Nazi perspective, that the Nazi perspective is always made visible in the cracks, in the details, in the moment that Roland Barthes might have called the punctum. In the cracks that open up through juxtaposition of perpetrators and victims, colonisers and colonised within a given image, it is our responsibility as present-day viewers to find the unredeemable horror of the Nazis' actions. For example, we've seen the poverty of the cobbler, the beaten up pots and pans in the market, the rubble of the house destroyed by another army, the fully uniformed Germans stridently walking down the street, all revealed too much. The shock of the difference between Germans and locals is too obvious. The same could be said of these photographs, with their visualization of exploitation, colonization, humiliation. Even if it is subtle, it is not easily missed. The tension between perceived and photographed reality mounts. This is a tension between the factual and the experienced truth. The fluidity, in closing, the fluidity of content, of use, of meaning, even of ideological significance, holds the photograph's greatest insights. So rather than thinking, how am I ever going to interpret them? I want to think about them, this fluidity as its profundity. It gives an image of war, and in particular of occupation, as we are concerned with it, that openly reveals the complexity and contradiction unable to be broached by official discourse. The profundity of these amateur images then comes in their ambiguity and their flexibility, what is not shown and its tension with what is. And so we look at these images today in 2016, and we must be discerning. We must understand the implications that arise from these ambiguities and ultimately assess what they might say about war, about how we look when we look at images of war. And finally, that gives us the responsibility for the images that we make of war. Thank you.